Good afternoon, Mr. Arlinghouse. I'll begin by saying I only wish that I could push my live classes as fast as I push your digital class. Today is April the 27th, which is tomorrow, rather it's Tuesday. Um, I don't think I'll be covering this material until Wednesday, but and clock's ticking. But anyway, let us talk about Jerry Powers and the U-2 incident, amongst other subjects at the time. In Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary began to try and act independently of Moscow, and with differing degrees of success. In Poland, the Communist Party did not want to accept the Soviet Union's choice for its next ruler. The Soviet leadership even visited Warsaw to, of course, make their objections known. They agreed upon Władysław Gomulka, who was a Polish communist. He began to reverse the collectivization of farming. He began to actually mend fences with the Roman Catholic Church. And in other words, and both these ideas were contrary to what the Soviet Union wanted. Other Eastern Bloc nations began to get similar ideas that they would go in a different direction than what the Soviet Union wanted. Hungary's actions and sympathy for the Poles resulted in violence. A new government in Hungary was installed under Imre Nagy. Nagy wanted greater independence for Hungary. This was in 1956, I do believe. Nagy wanted Soviet troops withdrawn from a neutral Hungary and also withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, which, of course, the Soviet Union was not about to allow. Because if they did it, then everybody would. The Soviets invaded Hungary in November 1956, and the United States did nothing, and deposed Nagy, who was later executed, and installed János Kadar as premier. Much of this action, however, was going on at the same time the rest of the world was watching the Suez Crisis, where the British, French, Egyptians, Israelis, the Soviet Union, the Americans were all, gathered around the Suez Canal. And I'm back, Mr. Arlinghouse. Yes, let's go back to where we were. Pull this up, thank you. So, as it says, much of this action was going on while the rest of the world was focused on, imagine, Britain, France, Egypt, Israel, the United States, and the Soviet Union all arguing over the future of the Suez Canal, future of Israel, and yeah, it wasn't a good thing. But so the Americans were discredited because they didn't do anything about this. So for approximately 25 years, the Eastern Bloc nations would be allowed almost no independent movements outside the Soviet ring of authority. The next great peace summit was to be the Paris Peace Conference of 1960. It was a failure. There were, as always, many bones of contention between the Soviets and the West. The Soviets finally succeeded in shooting down, like I know I told you about this last week, Mr. Arlinghouse, the U-2 spy plane of Gary Powers. You see, in those planes, those pilots were trained, told that if they were ever shot down, they were to kill themselves. This guy didn't do it. And so the Soviet Union, who had been accusing the United States of spying on them using planes for several years, and the United States kept saying, oh, no, we didn't do it, prove it. And this plane gets shot down, and the Soviet Union accused the United States again, and the United States, oh, no, we didn't do it. And then they pull up Gary Powers, have his picture in the newspaper, pieces of the plane, and yeah. Khrushchev demanded an apology, got none. The Russians had hoped that the United States and its European allies would have split over the future of Germany, particularly the city of Berlin. There was a split in the communist world, though, at the time between the Russians and the Chinese, who viewed the Russians as being soft. So, from the Soviet perspective, abandoning the summit was a way that the Russians could show the Chinese that they were tough. The United States President Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev met in Vienna in 1961. Kennedy came away from that meeting fully discouraged about the prospect of a lasting peace between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, let's talk more Germany. Since the separation of Germany, many East Germans had escaped from communist East German government via Berlin simply by going to Berlin, hopping the subway train, and then not returning to East Berlin, hopping on a plane in West Berlin, taking a flight to West Germany, and ta-da, they're free. That was an embarrassment to East Germany and the so-called showcase of communism. So with the backing of the Soviets, the GDR, the Deutsche Democratic Republic, East Germany, GDR, German Democratic Republic, built a two-level concrete wall surrounding West Berlin under the pretense of preventing the entrance of spies. Two-level, again, I think we've looked at this before. This, Mr. Arlinghouse, two levels. And in here is white space. No, in here is, of course, all the little tank traps and the mines and things like that. Machine gun emplacements. 1,000 people died trying to get through this barrier from East Germany into West Berlin and freedom. And so, yes. So, without a doubt, though, the closest the world ever came to a nuclear conflagration was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Sitting only 90 miles south of Key West, Florida, the Soviet Union had a major ally and a friend in the government of Fidel Castro of Cuba. In response to U.S. nuclear missiles on the Russian border in Turkey, the Soviets began to install nuclear missile bases in the jungles of Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The United States discovered this, protested the situation. The U.S. then, and in fact, it was a complicated matter. The United States, President Kennedy was the president, found out about these things, and he, this is a delicate matter. What are you going to do? They were literally teetering on a military, and would of course escalate into a nuclear exchange. The president called together a group called XCOM, which stands for Executive Committee, and he tasked the committee with coming up with solutions, possible solutions. They came up with 6 solutions, and those 6 solutions ranged everywhere from outright sending an invasion into Cuba to simply doing nothing. And in the end, they came up with the blockade, because the blockade around Cuba, which would then seize any ships going into Cuba that might carry material for those missile bases. The blockade, though, would put the ball in the Soviet Union's court and force them to make the first move. And so they blockaded Cuba, and for several days, the world kind of teetered on the balance of this nuclear war. What's funny is most people, in fact, all people in the United States, had no knowledge of it. Kennedy himself was going around. It was in the midterm elections.
Attention, please. Bus 86 is now in the bus loop. Again, all students who ride bus 86 is in the bus loop. Thank you.
Kennedy himself, they kept it all from the public. Kennedy was in midterm elections. It was 1962. He was going around the country campaigning for various and sundry people. It was October, campaigning for people running on the Democratic ticket for various offices. And when he got downtime, he would get on the phone and be talking to XCOM and his Joint Chiefs of Staff as to what was going on. But eventually, the Soviets actually backed out. Ships were heading towards Cuba, and they stopped and then turned around and headed in the other direction. The results of the Cuban Missile Crisis were quite far-reaching. It undermined Khrushchev's credibility in foreign relations. It increased the influence, though, of radical communist China, because it was like, the Russians were soft. It convinced the Soviet military leadership that they needed to be at least as strong as the U.S. The United States and the Soviets then signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Khrushchev resigned and was replaced by Alexei Kosygin and Leonid Brezhnev. Of the two, Brezhnev eventually will become dominant. In 1968, see how quickly we move here? In what became to be known as Prague Spring, the Czechoslovakian government under Alexander Dubček wanted more independence from the Soviet Union. In response to this, the Russians once again sent tanks and soldiers to ensure Czech compliance with the Moscow brand of communism. Brezhnev defended his actions in what he called the Brezhnev Doctrine, in which he claimed the right of the Soviet Union to interfere in the politics of any communist nation. I'm sure that they said we're copying exactly what the United States was doing. The invasion of Czechoslovakia was the last major Soviet intervention in Europe regarding the issues of the Cold War. Would you hold on, Mr. Arlinghouse? I'm going to get a picture. Hold on, please. And we're back, Mr. Arlinghouse. I want to show you a picture, another picture. Now, I took this picture when I was in Prague, in the Czech Republic. This is a picture of a cross, as you can see. It's in the main square in Prague. And on this spot, two young men, I think they were like early 20s, in response to the Soviet March invasion of Czechoslovakia, doused themselves with gasoline and set themselves on fire to protest the Soviet presence. It's one of those little known things, but yeah, I took the picture in Prague in the Czech Republic. And so, yeah, I just thought you'd find that interesting. All right. One of the most striking developments worldwide of the post-war era was the dismantling of some of the world's great and largest empires. World War II, that is terrible. Itself caused this breakup in two ways. The war caused many armies and navies to go back to Europe to defend Britain, to defend France, etc., etc. The Japanese Empire had chased many of these established European colonial administrations out of Asia. The United States, who was considered the champion of World War II in many ways, again was opposed to the maintenance of large colonial empires. And so, yeah, World War II brought that on. Some examples of this breakdown occurred. The British left India in 1947 and created two countries, India and Pakistan, which immediately began fighting each other. In 1948, Burma and Sri Lanka became independent. Burma and Sri Lanka were both British colonies. Ghana and Nigeria, also British colonies, became independent in 1957 and 1960. Self-ruling. Militant movements in Malta and Cyprus caused the British to leave there. The Dutch East Indies became Indonesia, the independent Republic of Indonesia, and the world's largest Muslim country in 1950. After a violent revolt, the Belgian Congo, yeah, that was 1962, and it was a violent revolt. They went around killing every Westerner they'd get their hands on. And payback for all those years of Belgian suppression. Became the independent Republic of Zaire. France was driven out of Libya and Algeria and North Africa, and Portugal lost the African colonies of Mozambique and Angola. This is called the decolonization of the world. Now, one Southeast Asian nation that fought a seemingly endless war of liberation before finally achieving it in 1979 was Vietnam. France had occupied Vietnam, which they called French Indochina, from 1857 to 1883, and had invested heavily in rice plantations, among other things. Although the Vietnamese fought for France in World War I, and many Vietnamese were educated in France, the French government ruled Indochina with an iron hand. A man named Ho Chi Minh would dedicate his entire life to the liberation of his native country of Vietnam. He, too, was educated in France. He desired an independent Vietnam, and he was consistently disappointed. He, in fact, fought in World War I for the French, hoping that he would get a hearing at Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, to make a case for Vietnamese independence. He did not. He then joined the Communist Party in 1920. When Japan drove out the French from Southeast Asia in World War II, Ho began to fight the Japanese. Ho. When World War II ended, Ho declared China, and by the way, notice I'm calling him Ho. That's not me trying to be funny, and that's not me being familiar with. You have to remember that in um, Southeast Asia, in fact, in most of Asia, a person's name is in reverse order. In other words, they give the family name first and then their surname. For example, if I was a native of Asia, my name would be Horton John. And so, yeah, so calling this guy Ho is not disrespecting him. Just like in China, it's Chairman Mao. His name is Mao Zedong, so but you call him Chairman Mao. That's his family's name. So Ho declared Vietnam an independent state with a government dominated by Communist Party members. The French, however, not yet ready to give up on their colony, wanted and for a short time attained a favorable Viet government under a guy named Bo Dai, who basically was a Westerner. They trusted him because he was Catholic, he could speak French. This Vietnam actually was visited by none other than John F. Kennedy, who went on a United Nations junket to see Southeast Asia and to, like, just see how these old colonies were faring and what their situation was. And John F. Kennedy did a lot of observations, and he came back basically talking, saying that these areas, Southeast Asia, are ready for independence and they should be allowed to be independent, including Vietnam. As it says, at first the U.S. had little interest in the Indochina War and even tacitly supported the Vietnamese drive for self-government. But when the communists under Mao Zedong took over mainland China, the United States began to believe that Vietnam was just another communist domino ready to collapse. So in 1950, the United States government announced it would give financial support to the French in trying to keep a friendly government in Vietnam because the French were friendlier than, obviously, the Chinese. Even though $4 billion of aid money went to from the United States to France for this purpose, the French finally lost to the Vietnamese communists under Ho Chi Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The fighting was brought to a temporary halt by the Geneva Accords of 1954. The Geneva Accords signed by the French Armed Forces and the Viet Minh, basically the nationalists. It divided the nation of Vietnam at the 17th parallel into North Communist Vietnam. How does this happen? And into under the control of Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam under control of a government that was to be democratically elected. Several changes in Southeast Asia began to increase American involvement in this part of the globe. For example, the United States, along with Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, Pakistan, and Philippines, formed an anti-communist military alliance called SEATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. The French also began pulling their military presence out of South Vietnam in 1955 because they saw it as a lost cause. Infighting in South Vietnam threatened the friendly Saigon government, and with the United States believing that the Soviet Union was behind all this, began to think more favorably of increasing its presence in Southeast Asia. At first, the U.S. just stepped in monetarily and supported a Catholic, non-French Vietnamese national by the name of Ngo Dien Diem, which was an error on the part of the United States in the long run because this guy was corrupt. The only thing the United States had in common with him was he spoke French and he was Roman Catholic. Ngo's policies alienated many of the very South Vietnamese nationalists who should have been his biggest supporters. In 1955, Diem declared the Republic of Vietnam, and the United States was paying the salaries of much of the government of this new republic. Nationalistic and communistic resistance to this government formed and called itself the Viet Cong. So you have two entities. You have the North Vietnamese Army regulars and then the Viet Cong, who were guerrillas who operated in the countryside, and operated largely in the vast rural areas of Vietnam and used guerrilla tactics to disrupt, terrorize the authority of the South Vietnamese government. Diem Diem's government reacted to these insurgencies by becoming more and more repressive and therefore more and more unpopular. Diem alienated the majority Buddhist population. In fact, it was during his regime that a Buddhist monk, and I forget what his name, I think his name was Phuc. Actually, a Buddhist monk dressed in his orange robes went to the busiest intersection in Saigon, sat himself down in the middle of the intersection, pulled out a can of gasoline, doused himself in the gasoline, assumed the lotus position, and then lit a match and self-immolated and just sat there burning to protest the policies of this Diem government. So the Diem alienated the majority of the Buddhist population, and finally in 1963, the United States allowed and even arranged for his removal from power and his murder. In other words, Mr. Arlinghouse, the CIA had the guy murdered in order to install a regime in South Vietnam that might be more favorable with the population of South Vietnam. The next choice of the United States, Nguyen Van Thieu, ruled South Vietnam from 1966 until it fell in 1975. Then he migrated to California, where he ran a liquor store until his death. Not lying. So, why don't we pick up with the Johnson administration tomorrow, Mr. Arlinghouse? Okay? All right. Thank you.